amendments and the case that she's making. I will be voting for this bill and supporting this bill wholeheartedly, and also supporting all those efforts to improve it, because I don't believe those two things are incompatible. We should never let perfect be the enemy of the good, but we should also recognise that legislation with holes in it will inevitably return to us. It's in that spirit that I have tabled these amendments, and I'm proud to see the support across the House for them, which are about the context in which this crime takes place. Let me be very clear that treating misogyny as something that we should tackle is not about flirting. It's not about banter. It's not about telling all men they are rapists. It's not even about new crimes. We can't apply a hate crime tariff to something that isn't already a hate crime. It is about something that is so widespread, it's become something we treat as a fact of life, but only for 51% of our population. Across the UK, a huge majority of young women, 85%, and nearly half of all women report experiencing sexual harassment in public places. Only 1 in 10 of them have ever reported receiving help after such incidences. Without recognising the role of misogyny in the day-to-day experiences of women in our society, our legal and criminal justice system masks the true extent of hostility that exists against gender. This isn't about criminalising wolf-whistling or flirting. It's about recognising existing crimes that are motivated by hostility towards somebody for their gender because of what they are, hate crimes. Whilst women have protection under equalities legislation in their workplaces, as soon as they step out the door onto our streets, they are not protected. If somebody is targeted on the basis of their faith or their religion, they can receive a tougher sentence on their behaviour on the basis of the Criminal Justice Act 2003. Somebody who repeatedly targets women in the same way faces no such comparable sanction. I hope in that way that we all agree our young women deserve better, because it is particularly our young women who are reporting this as part and parcel of everyday life. 1,000 women were asked by Plan International, aged 14 to 21, about their experiences in public settings, whether on transport, walking on the street, just going to school, or even going to work. 66% said they experienced unwanted sexual attention or sexual or physical contact in a public place. 40% said they experienced verbal harassment. 15% said they'd been touched, groped or grabbed at least once a month. What does that mean in practice? It means the experiences of my own constituents who I asked about this issue. The woman followed down the road by a man in a car, demanding that she get in, and then telling her that he was pranking her when she complained and a racist for refusing to go with him. The mother who wrote to me about her young daughter, who only last week had somebody come up to her in a tube station, put his face right up in her face and shout, "Sexy bitch," very aggressively in her face. Or sitting on a bus as men played videos of men masturbating and showed those phones to them to make sure that they had seen them. As the mother said, this isn't about trying to chat someone up. It's a power play. It's about exerting control and making women feel frightened and unsafe on their own streets, with girls and women nervous about retaliation and aggressively worried about what might happen if they fight back. The women who say that it is not about whether they're attractive, because violence is never far behind if they reject these offences. It's about what makes a hate crime. But it's not a pleasant and funny way of keeping women and girls feeling on edge all the time and unfree to move freely in their own airs. As the mother said, her children walk around, heads down, headphones in, tensely and on purposely avoiding eye contact or hassle from men. That is harassment. It's legally harassment. These women have said no, and yet these men still persist. It's worrying to all of us what a man who behaves like that might go on to do if he is not having his behaviour addressed. And I think it's a really important point here that we are very clear this is not all men. Most men in this country do not behave like that towards women, would be horrified to see that kind of behaviour, horrified for it happening to their mothers, to their daughters, to their wives, to their sisters, to their friends. So in proposing these proposals, I want to defend the reputation of the men of this country, that this is not about their behaviour, it's about some men's behaviour, enough men's behaviour that it makes women's lives difficult, enough men's behaviour that women experience hatred. Yes, I'll take that.
To the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'm listening as ever with great care to the case that she is making, and I have some sympathy. I think my problem is, and could you help me with this, I'm really troubled if we see all this offending as being offences of hate against women, because much of this offending is it is genuinely under the category of sexual offending, which often betrays a really deeper problem that absolutely has to be stopped and prosecuted and so on, and sometimes it's harassment. So I take the view, I wouldn't support the Honourable Lady's amendment. I think we'd need to know more about it. My own view is that this absolutely needs to go into the Law Commission, I don't care where, but it needs proper and full exploration so that we get it right, because I'm sure she's right that some of it is misogynistic, but not all of it.
I thank my colleague from Rochdale's intervention. As ever, I agree with much of what she said. I think what we need to say is that bigger thing that she's talking about is misogyny. Exactly. It is, there are men out there who are hostile towards women and act accordingly, and as a result, 51% of our population experiences harassment, experiences a particular type of crime. What happens at the moment is that we cannot name that and recognise that and differentiate that and therefore say, actually, as we do with racial or religiously targeted hatred, there is a premium on that, and that's what these amendments do. It's also about what drives the police behaviour, because, of course, if something is a crime, the evidence needs to be gathered about it. And I have to admit my honest frustration as the first female MP for Walthamstow, where we've had a number of people trying to report this, of the experience they've had. Let me try and give the Minister some example of the things that we're talking about. When the women who I've mentioned have reported these crimes, the responses they've got back. In particular, with the woman who was followed down the street by a man demanding that she get into his car and threatening her with his behaviour when she tried to say no, the police said, well, the behaviour is only threatening, abusive or insulting if the person intended it to be so, or if he was aware that it was so. The comments about him believing it to be a prank and so blown out of proportion would make that difficult to achieve. Let's think about that for a moment. For the victim of this behaviour, their experience, their fear, their terror means nothing because he just said, I was kidding. We wouldn't allow that in any other form of crime, yet why do we allow it when it comes to men who harass women? I'll happily give way to my colleague from the committee.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady, who, as always, is making a powerful point. Just because a defendant or suspect alleges that was what was in their mind and therefore they have a defence, that doesn't mean that a tribunal of fact, be it magistrates or a jury, are going to believe it. Very often they say, what a load of old nonsense, we're going to convict you. Does she agree?
I hesitate to fear that my honourable friend from Cheltenham wasn't listening to what I said. This is what the police said. This will never get to a point where a jury, where somebody would look at the evidence base, because we don't have the commitment to recording and recognising misogyny that means that the police are recording and recognising it in the same way that they do with racial or religious hatred. So before even it's got to the test that the member is setting, the police have said they're not going to investigate further. That's the challenge that women are facing across this country, is that we don't take this seriously. That's why 66% of women have changed their behaviour to try and avoid street harassment rather than the police taking it seriously. I'll happily give way.
I'm sure my honourable friend shares my concern that so many crimes which have a gendered aspect to them, we have rates of reporting where the rates of final prosecution are so low that we need to be looking at all reasons as to what is causing that.
I completely agree. This is the point about changing the mindset. Let me reassure the member from Cheltenham that where police forces have started to record misogyny as a hate crime, because this is not a new idea, particularly in Nottingham, it is transforming the experience of women, not just when it comes to street harassment, but when it comes to violence against women in total. I will happily give way to a Nottingham MP and also to my colleague, and then I really must make some progress, so I'm conscious people want to speak.
It's actually Nottinghamshire Police. I think it's the first force to do it. And we believe that the evidence is showing that it is having exactly the right effect upon the police force, that they are taking this seriously and seeing it as an offence.
I thank and I desperately apologise to the people of Nottinghamshire for forgetting the Shires. I'm not a fan of Lord of the Rings. I hope the member will forgive me. I'll happily give way.
Can I just, on the point she's making to do with the police as the former police minister and justice minister at the same time, the fact that the police wasn't willing to take it forward does not mean an offence hasn't taken place. Exactly. And so it's the guidance to the police, particularly from the police college now, which will actually drive this forward. It will be driven forward with evidence on what's happening in Nottinghamshire. We'll give them the evidence that they can actually... But the offence is there. Whether we change it here or not today, trying to force someone, whatever reason, into a car is an offence, and the police obviously take that seriously.
I understand the point that my colleague is making, but this is the chicken and egg syndrome that women for too long in this country have suffered with. The idea that because the offence is there, somehow it will get taken seriously. The bitter reality of what women experience in this country is that isn't the case. That is why New Clause 1 seeks to amend the guidance given to the police to recognise that, but it's also recognising that where we have a specific offence, that has driven change, and that's what Amendment 7 would do. I don't disagree with my colleague. I'm just saying that the reality is, unless we get the legislation, it isn't going to change the way in which the police are dealing with it quick enough for the women today to have the freedom to walk on the same streets as him without being frightened. I will take one more intervention. I really do want to make some progress, if that's all right.
Thank you. My honourable friend will know that one of the reasons that hate crime legislation is so powerful is because the assumption is on the victim and how they perceive the crime. So automatically, if misogyny was a hate crime, the examples that she's been given and the response by the police would not be permissible. So it shifts the power to the victim.
As ever, my colleague from Rotherham is on the money about this and the importance of having a victim-centred approach to this. We know from Nottingham what a powerfully positive experience it has been. Nottinghamshire, I do apologise. Sorry, Frodo. And in particular, for women from black and ethnic minority backgrounds to recognise the multiple intersectional hostility that they may face. We also know that this is not a new idea internationally. Spain, Croatia, Sweden, Estonia, Italy, Belgium and France all recognise gender and misogyny as a basis for hate crime. So what we are talking about here is replicating the model that we have right now for racial and religious hatred and saying that we should be able to recognise that form of hostility when it comes to sentencing for particular types of crimes, to recognise the hate as it is. There is already a framework that the ministers can use. Currently, the Crime Prosecution Service and the police already define hostility involving any events that is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice. The CPS doesn't have a legal definition of hostility, but it uses the everyday understanding of the word. We would all understand and recognise misogyny when we talk about ill will, spite, contempt, prejudice, unfriendliness, antagonism, resentment and dislike. What we are seeking to do here is echo the existing protections and put on parity the protections that we offer for someone about their religious background or their ethnic background with their sex background. Now, I freely admit that this is not a perfect amendment because it only covers upskirting. But upskirting is a classic example of an offence that happens within that misogynistic context, that is motivated by misogyny. I happily give way to the member for Cheltenham. I know he felt very strongly about this.
No, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady. She's making a powerful point, but she has identified what I think she's right to concede as a weakness, because it would be very odd, wouldn't it, if misogyny could be applied to the offence of upskirting, but not to rape, sexual assault, revenge porn. And does she agree with me that, therefore, a solution might be to get the Law Commission to look at this in a more holistic way?
It's almost like the member from Cheltenham read my mind, because he's right. Because actually, when we look at that data, when 15% of young girls say that they're being groped, and there might be somebody behind that, and we want to record where it's happening, then clearly this is not just about how people are using mobile phones in the modern world. This is about the hatred that exists amongst a small group of men in our society towards women and the damage that it is doing to our society as a whole. That's why I simply want to agree with him that what we're really asking for today, and I have said very clearly that we would withdraw these amendments if we can have a Law Commission review into all hate crime, including misogyny, which will look at both existing legislation and new legislation, and a meaningful review, one that is properly funded. I do not think that that is a lot to ask. I know that the Law Commission is open to looking at this and the importance of new legislation, because we did require new legislation when it came to extending those protections to people who are disabled and people who were from a transgender identity. But I'll happily give my...
Help the Honourable Lady. Would it be helpful if, in the interim, while we're waiting for a wider review of the law generally on hate crime, if the police guidance were to reflect, in the way it does on sexting, for example, the points that the Honourable Lady is quite rightly raising today?
Absolutely. I would love for all police forces, including the Metropolitan Police, and I know that the Mayor of London is looking at this, to learn from Nottinghamshire and the other 4 forces that are doing this. But I also recognise the police are asking Parliament to offer guidance on these issues too, and that's what we can do today. Because changing the law and offering new protections to women from that hatred would send a clear message to women that they can report these crimes, and to the police, not just that they should actually record it, but they should do something about it. That's why I'm pleased to see the Law Commission open to this, and also to hear from those working with these people, with people dealing with hate crime on a daily basis. This proposal has the support of Refuge, of the Southall Black Sisters, of Stonewall, of Citizens UK, who've been doing fantastic work in Nottinghamshire campaigning on this, of the Fawcett Society, of Tell Mama, of Dimensions, who work with people with disabilities, of Solace Women's Aid, of Respond, who work with children with adult learning disabilities. A whole panoply of people who recognise that hate is holding our society back, and actually it's right that we make sure that that doesn't happen. Right now, we say if a woman is targeted in her workplace, we know who is wrong. But as soon as she steps out, we don't know what happens. This amendment is about that gap in our legislation. Now, I know some people are going to ask here about men. Not just on Twitter, the what about the men's, the misandry point. And actually, I think the Law Commission review could look at all of this. But let's be clear, it's not men who are trying to report this on a regular basis. It's not men experiencing this on a regular basis. It's not men who are being targeted in this way. It's not men who say that we are worthy of protection at work, but not if we dare to go out at night. So let's engage in all the whataboutery you want to, but don't tell me that women's experiences of this doesn't matter. Because what you're saying when you argue against these proposals is that on that basis, those protected characteristics aren't that important. There's a limit to how far you want equality to go. I've had that in some of the comments I've had about this. A gentleman wrote to me today to say, obviously this is a law to prevent perverts' fantasies, yet as a society, why is it we have allowed women, and even our daughters and granddaughters, to dress even more suggestively than was the case generations ago, that must be giving rise to the fantasies out there? Under your eye, sir, if you've been watching, maybe be blessed. Or the man who wrote to me to say that I was abusing my position to push for misandry to be juxtaposed with misogyny, and to target the bloke-hating females of the species, because I'm a nasty feminist who is an offended snowflake whinger hell-bent on emasculating male society. Now, I know the vast majority of men here in this chamber, here in our society, don't want to be associated with that bile. They do want to make sure that people are safe. And that's what this is really about. Like I say, it's not about flirting, it's not about banter. I've yet to meet a couple who said that they met because he followed her down the street demanding that she get in the car with him. It is about how we make this a country where everybody is free. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm really done with all that whataboutery. I'm really done with all the opposition to this. It's not really a lot to ask, is it? We would like to be able to walk around this country free from fear. We'd like those who target women in a hostile way to be held to account. We'd like the harassment to stop. I'm fed up of being told that there have been private briefings that somehow this is too controversial, too difficult, or going to delay legislation. This is 2018. It's not Gilead. It's not about all men, but it is about some men. There is only one person who can stop this legislation, and that's the gentleman sitting opposite as the Secretary of State. But I know he doesn't want to do that. I know that he can hear a reasonable request to review all hate crime and look at new and existing legislation to get it right for the 21st century so that we protect everyone from being targeted for just being who they are.
Hear, hear.
But what I will tell him is that we won't keep waiting.
Good.
We won't keep being frightened. We won't keep being hassled for going out and doing our daily life. Please don't tell women to put up with this because you find it difficult. Let's get on and make 21st century laws to stop it.
Hear, hear.
New clause, requirement to amend guidance.
The question is the new clause won't be read a second time. William.
Speaker, my honourable friend, the member for Christchurch, was right. In objecting, he has given Parliament the proper opportunity to scrutinise this bill, and if he hadn't objected, the bill would have gone through on the nod. The amendments that we're debating today would not have been possible. Now, the failings of the private bill procedures are not for discussion at this report stage today. No one, least of all me, is denying the need to address the wrongdoing of upskirting swiftly. But that should not be at the expense of proper scrutiny, and we have to wake up to the need to jettison antiquated, opaque procedures in this place. Procedures that, in this instance, I believe have left a respected and long-standing honourable member, my friend, my fellow Wessex Member of Parliament, open to hostile attack for acting to ensure this new law is subject to appropriate levels of scrutiny. Turning to the bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, as we've just heard from the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow, the issues we are discussing here today, upskirting, are part of far broader issues to do with image-based abuse, to do with sexual harassment in public places, and it is right that we address this particular issue of upskirting, but it is also right that we reject this piecemeal approach for dealing with these issues. And the Select Committee for Women and Equalities is looking at the issue of sexual harassment in public places. And the Honourable Member for Rotherham is here today as well. We've taken copious amounts of evidence on this issue, and we will be issuing a report in the autumn dealing with many of the issues that the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow has raised today. The government needs a cohesive strategy in this area. This piecemeal approach, I believe, is not the right way forward. And indeed, if we had a cohesive strategy, we would not need this bill. In wanting to move so swiftly in changing the law, the government is right to use the existing Scottish legislation as its base. But the Scottish Act was passed 8 years ago. And in that time, the Scottish Government itself has recognised significant shortcomings in their own law and made changes. Changes that are not reflected in the bill before us today. The amendments made in the name of myself and Honourable and Right Honourable members from across all parties, the Conservative Party, Liberal Party, Plaid Cymru, SNP, Labour, seek to rectify those shortcomings and seek to tackle the emerging problems that we're seeing with the Scottish legislation. Very, very low levels of prosecutions and convictions in Scotland with a piece of legislation which has now been in place for 8 years. Now, Amendment 3 makes all upskirting a crime. At the moment, the bill is very narrowly defined. There should never be, I believe, an instance when it would be acceptable to take a photo up the skirt of anybody without their consent. The issue should be the lack of consent, not the motivation of the perpetrator. The perpetrator's intentions can be difficult for the police to prove. Is it to humiliate? Is it to alarm? Is it to distress the victim? They may never know or care who the victim is. The picture may be shared for a laugh, or indeed taken and sold and then sold on again. How do the police track the buyers and sellers of these photographs? The bill explicitly doesn't outlaw upskirting per se. It allows it it outlaws it in certain circumstances. Of course.
It's very generous. When we were looking at the evidence of what happened in Scotland, and I completely agree with her that with her amendments, I think it's vitally important we do that. The amount of prosecutions in Scotland which were very low, the lowest 3, I think. Partly was because they couldn't prove the intent of the upskirting. So instead of the offence just being, this is wrong, let's prosecute, what was the intent? We couldn't prove it. And that was the problems with the Scottish legislation, which is why they got such low, and why the amendments from the Right Honourable Friend actually does address that, which is, I hope, if we don't get it decided here, could be sorted in the other House once the report comes out from the Select Committee.
I thank my Right Honourable Friend for his intervention. You know, we've got to make the law work in practice as well as on paper. And as he's just pointed out, by making these things so complex, the police are finding it, I believe finding it, and he believes finding it very difficult to implement. But I'm not sure we actually have an investigation into that. And I think the Minister may want to talk to us a little bit further about what she may have found out from her Scottish colleagues, because presumably, and I think they are, looking in quite a lot of detail about this in Scotland. Of course I could.
I'm most grateful to them, and particularly for her very generous comments with which she began her remarks. She will have seen that this is one of the consequences of it being a government bill rather than a private member's bill. She will have seen the financial implications of the bill. And the financial implications set out in the explanatory notes are on the basis that there will be 29 prosecutions a year. That's all. Is my Right Honourable Friend surprised with all the hoo-ha about this and that the government's only really expecting 29 prosecutions a year?
My Honourable Friend will hear my thoughts on that in a few moments when I talk about my experience with estimates about the levels of revenge pornography, which were equally felt to be very, very low, but in practice have been much more. I wonder how accurate those projections are. My concern is that in drawing the bill in this way, it is artificially depressing the number of people who will come forward. And I think the courts may think that Parliament, in its very specific omission of certain groups of people who are perpetrating this crime, and we know they are already, they are artificially narrowing the number of convictions that might be brought forward. And I don't think that is the way Parliament wants this bill to work. And Amendment 3 would make sure that it worked far more broadly than that, and actually call to account all of the people who are committing this crime, not just a very small section of them. Now, the Minister was at pains in committee to underline that the two purposes in the bill are based on, word for word, as she said, on the Scotland Act. Under this legislation, as we've heard, just a handful of cases have been brought, just 3 a year over the past 8 years, an extraordinarily low level when we put that in the context of the statistics that the Honourable Member for Walthamstow was going through just a little earlier on. And research tells us that around 1 in 10 young people in this country experience upskirting, and that would mean far higher rate than just 3 in Scotland or just under 30 in the UK. So I think we need to hear from the Minister what information she's received from Scotland as to why there is such a low level of conviction and what they're going to be doing to change that. Because I was, as I've just referred to, I was interested to read the evidence of Alison Saunders, the Crown Prosecution Service, and whilst it was said that the motivations in the bill covered the overwhelming majority of cases, it was admitted that it was not inconceivable that suspects will advance the defence that they had another purpose, such as high jinks, and that's a quote directly from her. So how confident is the Minister that the CPS really has a true grasp of the nature of this offence, given the other data that we have, which implies it's far greater than just a handful of cases every year? As I said before, I seem to recall being told that there were just a handful of cases of revenge pornography, less than 10 every year, by the same Crown Prosecution Service. But with the right legislation in place, brought into place by the coalition government, we now see more than 500 convictions a year for revenge pornography. So adopting this Scottish model could be artificially limiting the number of cases brought forward. So what will the government be doing to address this? Will the Minister undertake to have a review of the way the law is working in practice, so that we are not simply having a nice discussion today, a nice debate today, which has very little impact on the lived reality of people who experience this appalling invasion of their privacy, this sexual assault, virtual sexual assault. So rather than requiring the police to tease out the motivation of an offender, now having to prove that a victim was humiliated, alarmed or distressed, Amendment 3 makes upskirting of any kind a crime. This has absolutely no impact on the ability of the court to be able to identify the most dangerous offenders and to place them on the sex offender register, and it would not increase the number of people who were drawn into that. Now, Amendment 5 directly tackles the other shortcoming in the 2010 Scottish Act by making it an offence to distribute upskirting images. Given the government's stated objective of copying the Scottish Act word for word, it's unclear to me why the government has chosen to omit this pivotal amendment made to the Scottish Act in 2016, which outlaws the distribution, particularly online, of upskirting images. Our existing laws in this country on this issue are at best patchy, and I'm aware of the Law Commission's long overdue inquiry into laws in the online world. But to present this bill with an essential element missing appears to me to be, at best, an oversight. Could the Minister explain why she felt she should omit this element of the bill when it was deemed to be an essential change required in Scotland? We do need a broader review of the law on image distribution, and I felt that strongly since I was first approached by a constituent about the issue of revenge pornography. But that will, and I'm delighted the Law Commission are now doing work in that area, but that will take a number of years to complete. In the meantime, outlawing distribution in this bill specifically will be a stopgap solution with the Scottish experience as a clear legal rationale. Can I ask the Minister if she will speak to her Scottish counterpart to understand why the amendments were made in Scotland and perhaps even revisit this in the Lords? I am absolutely sure their Lordships will also be keen to take a particular interest in this aspect of the bill. There was much talk in committee about not wanting to unintentionally criminalise people, particularly young people, and that's absolutely right. There can be few people who see that as helpful. But rather than dwelling on the perpetrators, we actually also need to think about the victims, the huge damage that is being done, particularly to young women who are on the receiving end of this type of sexualised assault. What message are we sending as a parliament to young men who are taking pictures up the skirts of their schoolmates for a laugh and seeing that excluded by this place from the law? What are we saying to the same young women about the value we put on their right to be protected from the law if we see this sort of non-consensual virtual sexual assault as being something which is a price worth paying? Finally, can I commend the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow on raising the issue of misogynistic hate crime. It's something that is under active consideration by the Women and Equality Select Committee in its current inquiry. And I wouldn't want to prejudge that inquiry, but will say that the scale of sex-based and gender-based crime needs to be recorded, it needs to be recognised, and it needs to be acted upon. That this needs to be tackled, I believe, in a much broader way than just upskirting alone, and I fully endorse her sentiment about the Law Commission. It could be said that including that element in the bill would be potentially problematic in other discussions. The Honourable Member for Bath is a tenacious campaigner, and it is to her credit that we are here today discussing this bill. The bill deserves the full support of the House, but that swift change does not have to be at the expense of proper scrutiny, and I think today's debate proves that point. Hear, hear.
Sarah Chope.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I only want to speak briefly, but I want to share my experiences, as last week I was in Korea, in Seoul, where upskirting has not been addressed either by society or by the law. And the situation there for women and girls is truly horrific. Girls are scared to go into any sort of public toilet, whether that's in their school or in a shopping mall. Women, when they go into public toilets, literally take a device and scan the toilet to see if they are going to be violated in this way. I don't want us to go down that route. I want us to look at what it is that's actually motivating society. Why is it that men seem to feel that they are entitled to expose women literally in this way, sharing the images, seeing them as objects that they are able to have control over to do whatever they want with? We've spoken a little bit about the potential for only being low prosecutions for this crime. I would see that as a good thing, because what making this illegal will do is send out the clearest message to people that this is a crime, this is an offence, and that you will have action taken against you if you carry it out. I'm incredibly grateful that we are now going to see relationship education coming in at primary for all children. And a key component of that is explaining to children what is and is not acceptable. It's explaining to children that there are these gender assumptions that are put upon them from the very youngest age, and that it's their right to challenge those and have society challenge those on their behalf so that they can live a full life and make the choices that they believe and are able to make. What I want to just throw through, of course, is to with no repercussion. So until we get the relationship education that shows children that this is a fantasy, I would argue, are anxious about this, and we are letting our children down. So for me, having this legislation about upskirting, saying, no, this is unacceptable. It's unacceptable for you to perpetrate, and it's unacceptable for it to happen to you, sends out a really clear message. And because of that, I am incredibly grateful that the government have brought this bill forward. I also want to particularly focus on the amendments around looking at including the distribution and the profiting of upskirting, because a lot of this is being done for money. In Korea, that's what's happening. People are going out not just for their personal gratification and to humiliate women, it is to make money from it. So it would be a grave omission if that is not included. And then I go to the substantive point that I've been trying to make. This crime is a symptom of the misogyny that we are experiencing in this country, that we're seeing escalating in this country, and that needs to be tackled in this country. So I urge the Minister to carry out the review that is being suggested, recommended by the Honourable Member from Walthamshire, and do incorporate the amendments in the bill as it moves forward. Thank you.
Sir Christopher Chope.
Mr Speaker, can I say how much I welcome this debate, and I'm grateful to the government for having taken forward this measure as a government bill rather than relying upon the private member's procedure. And I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, as chairman of the Women and Equalities Committee, for her generous comments about the importance of being able to properly scrutinise in a sober fashion the very serious issues which are contained in this bill, and indeed the wider debate which is being developed by the honourable member, the member for Walthamstoke. And in answer to her point on that, I would say bring on the Law Commission. And as a member of the Home Affairs Select Committee, I think it's very important that we should try and be abreast of new developments, and hate crime is one of those vile activities which I think we need to legislate for, but we actually need to do it in a really good way, and the best way of doing that is, I think, as she suggests, getting the Law Commission on board, because they've got that degree of expertise to help us in the House. And now that the original bill was brought forward, and the rest is history in a sense, because I shouted object on the 15th of June, Mr Speaker, and the following weekend was completely wrecked for myself and my wife because of a I think, a largely deliberate misunderstanding of the motives that I had. I know that Gina Miller didn't misunderstand because I spoke to her immediately after the debate on Friday, the 15th of June. But what happened was that on that day, in the newspapers, there was a report quoting my honourable friend, the Justice Minister, sitting on the front bench, saying that she had announced that by making upskirting a specific offence, we are sending a clear message that it will not be tolerated. And, Mr. Speaker, I thought that that was an expression of intention by the government that it was going to bring forward its own law on this. And then I was surprised to find that that wasn't its original intention. And I wrote a letter to the Times, which was published on the following Monday, and said that to ensure the fastest, fairest and surest passage to the statute book for a bill to outlaw upskirting, the government should introduce its own without delay, and then I shall give it my wholehearted support. And I'm glad that the government did do just that, and I put on record my appreciation for that. And as a result of the publicity that was generated around this issue, even the noble Lord Panic felt obliged to use the column that he has every week on the law in the Times newspaper to write an article on the 5th of July, headed up, "The upskirting bill must be scrutinised properly to make it effective." And in that article, and I know that my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, has referred to this article on other occasions. In this article, he makes it quite clear about the inadequacy of some of the existing law and the inadequacy, as he saw it, of the proposals that were contained in the original bill, and indeed are also contained in this bill. And it seems to me, and following what he is saying, that there's an enormous amount to be said for the amendment which is being put forward by my right honourable friend, the member for Basingstoke, and which I've signed, and indeed reflects an amendment that I put down originally, but obviously was never debated because I wasn't allowed to be a member of the second reading committee. And I think, Mr. Speaker, when we're talking about the issue of scrutiny, and I think is it Isabel Hardman who's recently written a book about the need for members of Parliament to actually concentrate on their key role of scrutinising rather than doing other things. That really, if we are going to scrutinise these bills, then we need to actually get down to looking at the detail, and that's what my right honourable friend has done. But isn't it a pity that because I think she expressed to the government whips, as I had done, that there were some differences with the government on the content of the bill, that immediately she couldn't be qualified, despite her position as the chairman of the Women and Equalities Committee. She was not qualified, Mr. Speaker, to serve on the committee, and because the Committee of Selection obviously decided that there were better stooges around than my right honourable friend, or indeed I for that matter. So if we're going to make the system of scrutiny work, we've got to actually free up the system of the selection, the Committee of Selection. And I know there's a motion down on the order paper for later today, and it may be, Mr. Speaker, that the mind of the government might be concentrated a bit if there is an objection to that motion down on the order paper. Of course I give way.
I feel the need to stand up for the members of the committee, having been a member of the committee, and simply reflect at committee stage the discussion we've had about treating misogyny as a hate crime didn't receive the support of the front benches, and that made me, as a backbench member scrutinising the bill, reflect on what more could be done to win that argument. Not always is it a good thing to be told no.
Exactly. I've got nothing but praise for the honourable lady, and fortunately, the whips on her side of the house, who are represented on the committee of selection, obviously did not think that it was necessary to allow this bill to proceed without any amendment at all. Although it's necessary, I think, it's worthwhile putting on record that during that committee debate, the spokesman for the official opposition did say the opposition support the bill completely and will not propose any amendments. So at that stage, Mr. Speaker, the opposition were blindly supportive of this legislation rather than being prepared to look and examine exactly what it might do or how it might be improved. So, yes, of course I could make it, my brother.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. He referred to procedures and processes and membership of committees. I would just like to remind him as well that the second reading of this bill was done in committee, which I actually think I had to slightly fight for to be a member of. Does he not agree with me that, using these sorts of techniques has not really speeded up the delivery of this bill to this point, but it has created an opaqueness in the methodology that Parliament's used?
Well, it has certainly done the latter, because I think the last is quite a long time ago so that we had a previous second reading committee that was set up to consider a piece of legislation. But in terms of actually making faster progress than this bill would have made if it had been kept as a private member's bill, there's no doubt about it that we are far further on than we would have been, because some of the other bills which had already had second readings, Mr. Speaker, are yet to actually go into or come out of committee and certainly get to report stage. So those are some of the advantages of having a government bill. And another advantage of a government bill is that obviously when it does go to committee, then is the opportunity for the committee to take evidence. And my right honourable friend gave very potent evidence to that committee, as did other witnesses. That wouldn't have been possible if it had stayed as a private member's bill. Of course, I'll give way.
I'm very grateful for him for giving way. Can he perhaps confirm that he said object on the 15th of June in order to speed up the process of this bill?
Well, my purpose in saying object was I wanted this bill to be scrutinised. And full marks to the government, and I don't always give the full marks to the government on things, full marks to the government for recognising that this was a bill that would only be able to be properly scrutinised if it became a government bill. And so did I achieve my objective? Yes, I did. And I'm pleased that the government did that. So, and I'm sure that the honourable lady, now having seen the strength of some of the amendments and new clauses, will reflect on the fact that if it had been left as a private member's bill for her to steer through, she would have been under pressure from the government throughout to say, do not allow any amendments to this. Do not do any put forward any accepting any amendments, because if you do, the government will prevent the bill making progress because it's so vulnerable as a private member's bill. And Mr. Speaker, that's particularly true when it gets to the House of the other place. And I know that I'm going to be told that I'm straying a little bit away from the amendments which I'm seeking to address, for which I apologise if I'm doing that. But what I'm hoping to be able to establish, Mr. Speaker, is support for both the amendment my right honourable friend has put forward to ensure that this bill delivers what it says on the tin, in a sense. The government said, the minister said, she was going to outlaw upskirting. And most people, I think, looking at that, certainly from the correspondence that I had, assumed that actually that was what was going to be delivered. And then when one looks at the detail of the financial implications of this bill, one then works out that actually the government is banking on it only costing £230,000 a year to prosecute all these offences, and one divides that by the cost of each one, which is £8,000, and one comes with a figure of 29 prosecutions a year. I don't think if one had gone out into the street, and perhaps the Honourable Lady, the member for Bath, if she'd gone out into the street in Bath and said, I'm bringing forward this really important piece of legislation and it's going to result in 29 prosecutions a year, that people would have really thought that it was significant as it was being portrayed. Of course I will.
Thank you. I appreciate that you're giving way. But does the member accept the point that if we make it very clear that it is a crime by this legislation, then what we're trying to do is prevent the crime being carried out? And so it should be seen as a good thing if this legislation is bringing down the cases of upskirting.
I agree with the potential deterrent role that legislation can have. But the analogy I think I would draw is the analogy with there's a general law against driving without due care and attention. But because of the incidents and public concern about people driving using mobile phones, which was, strictly speaking, an offence, and is still an offence, driving without due care and attention, the Parliament decided to introduce a specific offence, which, in a sense, replaced and made more specific the Parliament's concern about that particular activity. And the Honourable Lady will know that, sadly, despite bringing in that specific offence, it hasn't actually had the deterrent effect that many people had hoped, and there are still very large numbers of people who are offending against it. But if one draws the analogy between that and the specificity of the offence contained in this bill, which we're seeking to amendments to which we are seeking to discuss, if the general common law under which a lot of upskirting activity is prosecuted at the moment, if that general common law is replaced by specific statutory law, then what will happen in practice is that prosecutions will be under the specific statutory law rather than under the general common law, which, as the Noble Lord Panic has said, is vague and ambiguous in many respects. So if the consequence of this legislation is that all offences of upskirting are then brought within the ambit of this piece of legislation and prosecuted on that basis, that's great. I'm all in favour of it, and it's going to mean... But if we're going to do that, then I don't think we should constrain those offences by saying that they've got to be... They can only be proved if various motives are proved as well. Why isn't, as my right honourable friend was saying, the mere fact that somebody takes a photograph without the consent of the victim, in inverted commas, why isn't that per se in itself an offence? Why do we have to circumvent it, limit it in the way that this bill...
I've been listening patiently and most attentively to the honourable gentleman who's offered the House a procedural disquisition and some remarks which touch on what might be called the theology of the bill, and that is of very considerable interest to the House. The honourable gentleman has also animadverted to a number of the explanatory notes to the bill, but if he felt able fairly promptly to proceed to the specific amendments, specifically guidance, purposes, aggravating factors and notification under the Sexual Offences Act 2003, then he would be beautifully in order. Sir Christopher Chope.
I'm most grateful to you, as ever, Mr. Speaker, for your guidance on these matters, and turning specifically to my right honourable friend's amendment number 1. That amendment would remove from the bill any requirement to prove a motive. And it seems to me that the activity in itself should be criminal in itself. It shouldn't need to have a motive ascribed to it. And as soon as you have to establish a motive, it makes it much more difficult for the prosecuting authorities. It makes it so easy for members of Her Majesty's Constabulary to say, well, there was no motive. But why do we need to have a motive in respect of an offence which outrages public decency? And I haven't had anybody who's written to me to say they think that upskirting is a reasonable activity in which to participate. So I hope very much that the government will accept my right honourable friend's amendment number 1. Being conscious, Mr. Speaker, as always, of the issue of time, can I also refer to my amendments, because the amendment which I put forward in my own name is to change the notification rules under clause 1, subsection 4, because quite rightly, and this wasn't contained in the original bill, the government is saying if people are guilty of upskirting for the purposes of sexual gratification, then in certain circumstances they should be put on the sexual offenders register. My view is, why shouldn't everybody who's committed an act of voyeurism for the specific purposes of sexual gratification be put on the sexual offenders register? Why should being put on the sexual offenders register be conditional upon the issue as to whether the offender has been sentenced to a term of imprisonment, detained in a hospital, or made the subject of a community sentence, or whether the victim is under 18? Surely, if we want to toughen up the law and following the Honourable Member for Walthamstow to try and deter activity of this, then why don't we toughen up the law as proposed compared with what's proposed in this bill, and ensure that all cases of upskirting with the intent of achieving sexual gratification result in being put on the sex offenders register? My amendment also says that there should be an exemption there in relation to offenders aged under 18, and I had a discussion with my honourable friend, the Justice Minister, about this, and she said she wasn't quite sure about allowing any exceptions. But compared with the large numbers, I mean, if we're talking about 29 prosecutions, then we're hardly going to be talking about very many people going on the sex offenders register. But it seems to me that it would be easier to say that people over 18 will go on the sex offenders register because of the implications that can flow for young people if they find that they're on the sex offenders register in circumstances where they are full of remorse. And I can remember, Mr. Speaker, some time ago when I was a practising member of the bar, and a candidate came forward for pupillage, and when asked as to whether he had done anything in the past of which he might be ashamed, he admitted to the offence of mooning while he had been at Cambridge University. And some of us in the chambers were quite sympathetic or understanding about that, but the head of chambers took the view that anybody who had behaved in such an outrageous manner was unfit to be a member of certainly the set of chambers of which I was a member at that time. And I quote that as an example of some of the unforeseen implications that can come from people who find themselves put on a sex offenders register. But if you are committing upskirting for sexual gratification and you're over the age of 18, why are we faffing about and saying, well, you may or may not have to go onto the sex offenders register? Why don't we put those people onto the sex offenders register? Yes, of course. Yes.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. This, for me, is a difficult issue, whether or not offenders should be on the sex offenders register, because many of these offences will be committed by under 18s on under 18s. They will receive short sentences, but they will be committing offences on other children. I think it's right that we have this discussion now. Does he agree with me on that? And does he further agree with me that perhaps the police guidance on sexting may be very useful in working out a way forward on this difficult and sensitive matter?
I agree with my honourable friend, absolutely. It's very important that we should have this discussion. It's quite complicated, and I agree with her about the suggestion she's put forward. So, again, another argument in favour of having a proper, sober debate on this issue without getting too much of emotional involvement in it. Can I finally say, Mr. Speaker, that if the government is reluctant to accept the amendments that have been put forward today and is reluctant to extend the scope of this legislation so that it embraces more than 29 potential prosecutions every year, then I hope that when it reaches the other place, that they will look at this legislation and say, well, we want to make sure that it actually delivers what it says it's going to deliver, which it certainly doesn't at the moment unless it becomes amended. And the final consequence of it being a public bill, a government bill, is that when it goes to their lordship's place, nobody will be deterred from being able to bring forward amendments on the basis that if they bring forward amendments, it means there won't be time to consider those amendments in private members' time in the House of Commons, and therefore it will effectively kill the bill. That argument won't run in the House of Lords in relation to a public bill, which this is, and that's another reason why it's a very good idea that it is indeed a public bill. So I'm very much enthusiastic about my honourable friends from Basingstoke's amendment, and obviously equally enthusiastic about my own, Mr. Speaker.
Well, has the honourable gentleman completed his oration? He has. Thank you. Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is a pleasure of sorts to follow the honourable member from Christchurch. We have disagreed on things, but I am pleased to say that I agree with him that we want to have this bill as good as possible, and particularly to act as a good deterrent so this vile practice is not being considered. Mr. Speaker, I am immensely grateful that the government has taken the upskirting bill through the House so quickly. Everyone involved can be very proud in what has been achieved so far. This bill is testament to how we can all work together constructively. We all agree that upskirting is a vile practice and has to become a specific sexual offence. We all agree that either to gain sexual gratification from upskirting or to take an image for the purposes of distress, humiliation or alarm should not be tolerated and should now be prosecuted in law. We also agree, at large, that the worst offenders should go on the sex offenders register. This bill is aimed at stopping a vile offence by either deterring upskirting in the first place or by successful prosecution of offenders. We want to ensure that everybody is protected from this crime. What we are debating today are not these common principles, but how to really bring about effective prosecution and not allow anyone to slip through the net. The wide-ranging discussion on this bill over the summer have led me to put my name to amendments that explore how we can make this upskirting bill as watertight and effective as possible. I believe we can strengthen the legislation in two ways. First, as currently drafted, the bill makes upskirting a sexual offence only for sexual gratification or if photos are taken to humiliate, distress or alarm the victim. This means that those taking upskirting images for other purposes, for example, financial gain, non-sexual enjoyment or for having a bit of a laugh, would not be committing an offence. However, I believe that whether an offence has taken place should be determined by whether or not the victim has consented and whether the images were taken intentionally. The harm caused to the victim is substantial, regardless of the motivation of the perpetrator. Upskirting should be an offence regardless of the motive. And second, the bill as it currently stands should make the taking of the image an offence, but not necessarily the distribution of the image. Amendment 5 makes it an offence to distribute an upskirting image without consent. And there can be two defences: one, to prevent or detect crime, or two, that the person distributing the image did not know that it was an upskirting image. The large increase of sexually offensive images online is a real problem. Only on Monday, the Home Secretary made a speech talking about his shock of sexual exploitation of children online and the responsibility of online platforms. I understand that the government is intending to conduct a wide-ranging review of this problem, but it would probably be years before we could successfully tackle the issue in law. Therefore, I see no harm trying to prevent the distribution of upskirting images now, even if other legislation will be lagging behind. Mr. Speaker, I want this bill to stop the vile practice of upskirting. It should be a successful tool for prosecution, but it should also act as a deterrent. Zero tolerance, no loopholes. Since I got involved in the upskirting campaign, I have understood how distressing upskirting is to victims. I want to make sure that anybody, even considering taking an upskirting image, should think twice. And I would like this bill to have a wider purpose, to inform the wider discussion around consent, online distribution of sexual images, and outdated attitudes, especially towards women. And I think we have heard very well on this subject today already, and I very much welcome the contribution of the Honourable Member for Walthamstow. This bill marks an important stepping stone, and I'm grateful for the largely consensual debate on how we can stop upskirting for good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Mike Penning.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a privilege to follow the Honourable Lady from Bath, and I congratulate her with her tireless work that she's done, and particularly Gina Martin as a campaigner. I wish she was with me in my constituency campaigning on many issues that I need, because she's a brilliant campaigner. Can I say, Mr. Speaker, I wasn't here on the Friday in question when the private member's bill was objected to, but I was very conscious that when the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow said not all no's are bad. Well, there was a no, and that no means we're here today. And the bill that is before us is not perfect, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second. But the reason we have the amendments and the reason it has been expedited through is because of what happened there. So while my honourable friend from Christchurch was vilified in some parts of the press and attacked, I think what he wanted in his heart of hearts, which he's objected to many bills over the years, many bills, is he wanted scrutiny, and he wanted the government to come forward with the arguments that they had for or against, rather than as we get squeezed through the technical procedures, Mr. Speaker, of Friday sessions and all this sort of thing. And as a previous minister, Mr. Speaker, I know the minister will be under pressure not to accept amendments. I've sat in that front bench, on the Treasury bench, on many occasions, and had the notes and the briefings and everything. And very often I got myself in trouble, Mr. Speaker, because I would say, no, common sense needs to prevail here. Some of these amendments are right. And some of these amendments that are on the order paper today, in my opinion, if necessary, and the front bench don't support them, or give a very good reason what they're going to do, how they're going to address it in the other house, this house should divide. Because the country is looking for us to give a lead on very important legislation. And one of the reasons that there aren't as many prosecutions about the offence as it already is on upskirting, and some of the offences that the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow was alluding to in her contribution, is the police and the Crown prosecutors don't have the confidence that this place intended that to happen. I know that because I was a Justice Minister and a Victims Minister and the Police Minister, and I've had that put back to me. What is the intent? If Parliament intends us to do that, the judges say this all the time in the appeals courts, if Parliament intended that, it would have put it on the face of the bill. But there are things missing on the face of the bill, Mr Deputy Speaker, which I'm going to address now. In New Clause 1, which is the main signatory from the Honourable Lady from Waltherstow, I agree with her that that expands it more out. But the Law Commission is where that needs to be. And I hope when the Minister stands up, common sense will prevail and we don't need to divide, and that actually the Law Commission can look in the wider aspect of this hate crime as it is. Mr Speaker, as a father of two gorgeous young ladies that have now grown up into wonderful women, I would be distraught if anybody attempted to take photographs under their skirts. I know what they would feel. I know what my wife would feel if it happened to her or it happened to their children. And I said, to me, this is a complete no-brainer that this House has had to catch up very slowly with technology and mobile phones. You know, the peeping Tom that was around in the old days is now on the end of a mobile phone on the tube, at work, in the lift. That's what they are. They're peeping Toms. It's an offence. This voyeurism is an offence. So why I do not understand is why all upskirting isn't on the face of this bill that it is an offence. You can't accidentally, and I heard this earlier on, accidentally upskirt a lady. How on earth can you accidentally take a photo? Well, if anybody in this House knows how you could do that, or how that could possibly happen, it's again a no-brainer. So the whole offence of upskirting should be an offence. It should also, I cannot understand why it has to be to distribute for cash. If you're distributing these images to other people, that's abhorrent, it's horrible. Why isn't it on the face of the bill that this is an offence? And why, in addressing Amendment 6, why, if you're convicted of these offences in the court in this country, are you not put on the sex offenders register? I accept some of the points my honourable friend from Chichester was making to do with young people, but that's for the courts really to decide if they're under 18 whether they should. But if they're over 18 and they have been convicted of this offence, an abhorrent, horrible offence that you can't do by accident, you either do it from money, you do it for your own sexual gratification, you should be on the sex offender to protect the people that we were sent here to protect. And I think, for me, the government have done the right thing by coming forward, expedited it, got to this position. But it will be an absolute crying shame, a missed opportunity to send a message out there that this House understands, and this government understands, how abhorrent this offence is. If you do it, you will be convicted in a court. If you're found guilty, you'll go on the sex offenders register, and there is no argument that you did it by mistake, it was just a joke or anything like that. It is not a joke to the lady it has happened to. My daughter, my wife, my constituents. We should accept the amendments as they are. New Clause 1, I think we can probably agree that if the Law Commission and the government commit to doing that, as a Justice Minister, I'm slightly apprehensive because lots of things get referred and never come back. The long grass is very deep from the Justice Department at times. But if we take the Minister at her word, if she would agree to that, but I would really like the Minister to accept the amendments as they are. It's not going to cost the government huge amounts of money. There are, on their own estimates, a tiny amount of people are going to be prosecuted. I think the estimates are wrong. I think there'll be lots more if the police have the guidance and the Crown Prosecution Service have the guidance from this House to protect our constituents and our families. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you. Liz Savile-Roberts.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Lefarydd. And it is an honour to honour the Right Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead and his excellent speech, which I felt summarised much of what I intend to say now, but I hope you'll forgive me in that. Firstly, I'd also like to refer to New Clause 1 and the need for a review in the Law Commission. I think in relation to hate crime, we do need to look at the rates of reports as compared with the rates of successful prosecutions. And if those are low, if there is something that appears difficult to explain, that there is then a consideration as to why they are low. And I do suspect that in many cases we will find that we are trying to use possibly common law or pieces of statute which are now dated, and they're just not clear. And under the weight of criminal activity, it then is sometimes very challenging for the police how they're actually going to deal if there's not a clear route ahead. But I would like specifically to speak to the, in support of the amendments tabled in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke, and first of all with Amendment 3, which of course along with Amendments 1 and 2 makes all upskirting an offence regardless of the motivation of the perpetrator. Now, as I think I just said, the legal clarity necessary to prosecute upskirting, it does seem, I think many of us feel, that it becomes blurred when the focus is directed towards establishing an answer to the question why someone has taken an intimate photo of someone else, and that having happened without that person's consent. Now, taking a private, intimate photo of someone else without their consent should always be illegal. The legislation as it currently stands ignores victims and their experiences and places its focus solely on the intentions of the perpetrators. It thus fails to capture all instances of upskirting, fails adequately to protect the victim, and fails to make all prosecutors, all perpetrators, liable to persecution. These amendments rightly take the issue of consent as the primary concern, although it is evident that the motivation of the perpetrator should not be completely disregarded. Rather, it should be treated proportionately, as we do in other crimes. Serious sexual offenders, such as those who commit upskirting for the purpose of sexual gratification, say rather than for financial gain, should still be subject to notification requirements, and this amendment does not stop this from being able to happen. The prosecution of an act of upskirting can both examine whether consent was gained when the image was taken and look at why the image was taken in order to ensure that offenders are treated appropriately upon conviction, with some being placed on the sex offenders register as necessary according to their motivation. This amendment does not seek to make all perpetrators of upskirting offences subject to notification requirements, but it seeks to ensure all perpetrators of upskirting offences are able to be prosecuted regardless of the reasons behind their actions. Now, the Minister has justified the current drafting of legislation on the grounds of existing legislation in Scotland which it mirrors. It is entirely right that we legislate to ensure upskirting is illegal, but simply copying the legislation as it stands in Scotland, which has recently revealed to be in need of review, will not result in an effective or a long-term solution. The CPS previously to us in committee stated that if the Scottish legislation were to be replicated in England and Wales, they would anticipate that most offending would fall comfortably within these categories. But the evidence from Scotland now shows that this is unlikely. Recent figures show that in the first 6 years of the law being in operation in Scotland, I think over all those years, just 21 prosecutions have taken place out of a total of 142 charges reporting. There's only 15%. This is a clear example of one of those sorts of gendered legislation which is not coming forward with effective prosecution. It would be, it seems to me, irresponsible as legislators to press ahead with this legislation when we have clear proof from many reports due to be brought to the police in its name that they will be unlikely to reach successful prosecution. And I would now move on to speak in support of Amendment 5, which seeks to close the biggest loophole in this proposed legislation.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady who's making a powerful speech, but I just want to explore one thing, if I may. She's saying, I think, that you should be guilty of an offence whatever the motivation. However, if a court were to find that it was committed for the purposes of obtaining sexual gratification, then the defendant should be put onto the register. But how, if Clause 3 is deleted, will a court be able to establish what the motivation was? Isn't there a danger that it wouldn't be a jury deciding? Instead, it would be a judge. And isn't there some logic to ensuring that it will be the jury who will determine this important matter, which has important consequences for the penalty that follows?
I think this is a debate that, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. I think this is a debate that we need to have in relation to these crimes. But nonetheless, if we find ourselves in a situation where the motivation solely is the means by which we decide to move ahead or not, then we are providing a loophole, we are providing a bolt hole which will give people a defence, which I believe to be the case, certainly, and I hope that the Department will be discussing further with their counterparts in the Scottish Government as to exactly what the reasons why there are so low rates of prosecution there. But if there are concerns now that we are giving a line of defence, if you like, on the grounds of motivation, we must be very careful. Are we prioritising the right issue here? Or is that rather a matter, as I was hopefully trying to explain, of proportionality when it comes to the sentencing and when we know what the motivation is in place? If I may move on now to speak in support of Amendment 5, which seeks to close, as I said, the biggest loophole in this legislation, that it would namely be an offence to take an upskirting picture, but not necessarily an offence to distribute it. When this amendment was introduced in committee stage, the Minister explained that there were already statutes that might capture the distribution of such photos, such as Section 1271 of the Communications Act 2003 and Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act 1988. Just as the present motivation clause of this legislation means that not all upskirting would be outlawed, neither does the present legislation outlaw distribution in all cases. Now, we should not, again on this count, be passing legislation that only works to a certain extent. I do appreciate that DCMS and the Law Commission are working together to look into the onward sharing of images as part of their review in relation to online abuse. But failing to include anything in this legislation in terms of distribution does risk creating a giant loophole which would facilitate the further distress of victims. And it is, I must say, an entirely predictable outcome that we can see from where we stand now. Now, we have the opportunity to address this issue now, and we should seize it instead of holding back. When the original upskirting legislation was passed in Scotland, it had to be followed up with additional legislation to cover the distribution of these images. And the UK government, unfortunately, appears blithely to be following the process of the original legislation in Scotland, and I would propose that we might take the opportunity to learn from their pitfalls experience there, rather than running headlong into the same complexities. And I would urge, as I said earlier, the Minister to commit to work with Scottish legislators in order to strengthen the legislation that we're making here. Now, just to close, I encourage the UK Government to join colleagues across the House in support of these amendments. There has been some excellent speeches, I think, this evening. Or risk otherwise waving through a piece of legislation whose excess complexity and obvious loopholes will hobble it from day one.
Thank you. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I do want to keep these remarks very short. I want to begin with acknowledging why we're here today, why we're discussing this very important issue, and that's because of the incredible work of Gina Martin and her lawyer, fellow Aberdonian Ryan Whelan, who have worked so hard to campaign on this issue, to raise awareness of this issue and to take it forward. I remember meeting Ryan in my constituency office and talking about the experiences that Gina had as a victim of upskirting. And I just could not believe that this was happening across England and Wales. It felt wrong that it was happening, and it certainly motivated me to get involved in the campaign so that we could actually give justice to women and victims and ensure protection for all young women going forward. And I'd like to thank all members of this House, because it's actually had genuine and real cross-party support from the Labour Party, Plaid Cymru, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party, who have all shown real support for this bill, which has helped it to progress so swiftly through this House. And it's at moments like this that Parliament shows it at its best, when you see this cross-party cooperation to put something on the statute books that will do good for our constituents, because we all came into Parliament to make a difference. You want to be able to serve your constituents. You want to be able to change the law, to right wrongs, and to protect some of the most vulnerable. And together we are doing that. So often we see on the television the spats that we have, and there'll be many more. You see rowdy Prime Minister's questions. Often this doesn't get coverage, and genuinely I think this is when our Parliament is at its best. Because the practice of upskirting is truly horrific. Taking a photograph up a person's skirt or their clothes without their consent. And those who have been victims of such a crime have been so clear about how it has personally affected them. Some have described their experiences of going through upskirting as scarring, as a real invasion, as embarrassing, as humiliating. And I know that the Minister even referenced this when she was talking to the committee, saying that actually one victim described the invasion of upskirting making her want to peel her skin off, to scrub herself clean. That's how it made her feel. So there is a real gap in the law that needs to be filled. And we can do that. This is the moment to do it, because upskirting is a terrible and horrific crime, horrendous invasion of privacy, and it's right that offenders are going to be appropriately punished for that by creating a specific upskirting offence. And this whole House will be able to send a clear message to potential perpetrators that this behaviour will not be tolerated. To address the amendment in the name of the member for Walthamstow, and I know this has been touched on by other members, including my honourable friend for Cheltenham, I would simply note that the amendment's not about whether misogyny should be a hate crime, but is, and on its terms can only be, about whether misogyny should be introduced as an aggravation in respect of this one offence. I believe that to be inappropriate, and that it would be better for this bill to be passed unamended, and for the Law Commission to look at the merits as to whether misogyny should be a hate crime. And I would hope there would be consensus for that in this House. Lastly, Mr Speaker, because I don't want to take up too much more time, I think that this House is showing itself at its best, and as new technology continues to adapt, so should the law. And it's right that this bill has come through Parliament so quickly, and that we get it onto the statute book as soon as possible. Today's debate, and in fact the whole debate around this, has been thoroughly thought-provoking, and it's right that we've given it the due scrutiny. And I would like to thank all members who have participated, and also the member for Bath who, in taking forward her private members bill, really helped to take this issue forward. And it's right that we're taking this action. It's right that we're taking it quickly, and I look forward to hearing the Minister in her summing up. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to thank all the members of the Bill Committee on all sides of the House for the work that they put in and for the active participation of them all. And can I say that none of them were stooges. They all actively participated in the Bill Committee stage. But I also want to congratulate the campaigner, Gina Martin, who highlighted this very important issue and the lacuna in the law. I also want to acknowledge the work of the Honourable Member for Bath, who introduced this as a private member's bill. Mr Speaker, this is, you could say, one of those lessons in the laws of unintended consequences. When the Honourable Member for Christchurch objected to giving this private member's bill a second reading, resulting in an outcry and criticism every quarter, it is fair to say that this bill will not have seen the light of day were it for that. In 2017, the Shadow Justice Secretary, the Honourable Member for Leeds East, wrote to the Chancellor to ask, Lord Chancellor, to ask the government to enact this legislation in government time. The government refused to do so. However, we are pleased that it has been now catapulted into bringing this bill. We have welcomed this bill at all stages and have supported the government. And the reason we've done so is because we recognise the urgency of the situation that needed to be addressed. The bill was drafted by Ms Martin's lawyers, and what we did not want to do was to try in any way cause difficulties or delay in the proceedings. Let us be clear, upskirting is a depraved violation of privacy. It's shocking that in England and Wales there is not at the moment a specific criminal offence to cover this offence, and that instead it's being prosecuted under more general offences of outraging public decency, or when we know it's to be difficult to satisfy many of those requirements. The law as it stands means that often the focus of the offence is on protecting the public from potential exposure to lewd, obscene or disgusting acts, rather than protecting the individual victim. Some of the victims have been prosecuted for upskirting on the basis of outraging public decency. That is not really what that particular provision of the law was designed for. The law should focus on individual victims and the crimes committed against them. A number of cases highlighted the failings of the current law, and if I start with the case in 2007 of Simon Hamilton, a barrister who was convicted after secretly filming up the skirts of women in supermarkets. He was able to appeal on the basis that none of the victims had been aware of the filming and no one had seen it, so the public decency had not been outraged. And then there was a case of Guy Knight, a former chartered accountant who took photographs of women's skirts on trains over a period of 5 months while commuting to work. He was caught after suspicious passengers reported to the police. More than 200 illicit images were found on his phone and laptop, and 10 of the women in the pictures were traced by the police. None of them were aware of the fact that they had been photographed. Now, this campaign came about because Miss Gina Martin, about a year ago, she was at a festival in London with her sister when she noticed that a man behind her had taken photos up her skirt. Shocked and distressed, she sought help from the police. But the law was not sufficient to ensure they could help her, which is why the law requires a changing, which is why we have been supporting the government on this legislation throughout. We have to remember that many women's rights across the UK are being affected. It can happen to any woman on a public transport, in a park, at a concert, or even just a walk along a busy street without the victim even realising that the photographs have been taken. And it's actually impossible to judge how many women have been victims of upskirting, although a quick internet search will bring up hundreds of sites and thousands of images. There may be millions of more pictures on phones and laptops taken on streets, escalators in shopping centres, supermarkets, nightclubs and other places. And therefore, I think the Honourable Member for Christchurch, when he thinks that the bill thinks only 29 cases might be covered in a year, perhaps is wrong. There are endless web forums where amateur upskirters can exchange tips on how to get the best picture. One was posted by a man who made a cam bag, a holdall with a specially made pocket with a hole for a digital video camera lens. And the post says, "Never forget to shoot their faces before or after to know which girl the ass belongs to. After the first ... asses, they look very familiar and you lose most of the fun. After upskirting them, either step back and wait for them to turn up or step by them and shoot directly sideways." Another poster on this same forum says that he operates mostly at theme parks and tourist hotspots, or really anywhere that draws a large crowd of spectators and cameras. He finds an attractive young lady, preferably a teen for my taste, and then I evaluate the situation. And he said, yes, of course.
The Honourable Lady referred earlier to my honourable friend from Christchurch referral to 29 cases. It wasn't he who was saying there were going to be 29 cases, it's the government. Does she not share the concern that that is a very, very low number given the prevalence of the problem and the evidence that she's giving of the number of websites where this issue is so blatant?
I thank the right Honourable Lady for that intervention, and I stand corrected. But it's just that the Honourable Member referred to the 29 number of times, and I sense that he was trying to say that the government or the people who are estimated how many people are affected is 29, and somehow it therefore makes the bill not that important. And what I was trying to emphasise, and hopefully by referencing, as the right Honourable Lady has said, about what's happening on online, I think we can see potentially this bill covering many, many more people. Of course.
If she needs some reference to this, I'm surprised that she does, because it's contained in the explanatory notes. Under the financial implications of the bill, paragraphs 29, 30 and 31 make it clear that the cost per prosecution is £8,000 and that the total cost to the Exchequer of this legislation is going to be £230,000 a year. If you divide one into the other, that's where you get the figure of 29.
Well, I thank you very much for that helpful lesson in arithmetic. I think I can do that arithmetic. The point I was trying to make is that the Honourable Member for Christchurch repeatedly kept repeating that figure, which suggested to me that he is trying to suggest that this bill perhaps does not cover as many people as it is proposed to be purported to do so. And that's the point I was trying to make. Can I then come on to another example, which shows that which a man posted, "I've been upskirting chicks mostly at clubs for almost 2 years. The club I go to is a great spot. Real crowded, strobe lights going, loud music, so no one notices me sitting near the edge of a dance floor, and if a woman in a skirt ends up by me, I stick the cam under and snap." The legislation is needed to deal with these types of cases. Now, number of backbenchers have tabled amendments. And can I say that the Honourable Member for Walthamstow has spoken with great passion about the amendment that she proposed, about the street harassment, and on that we are supporting her. But I would also ask that what the government needs to look at urgently in a proper bill is a comprehensive bill which deals with many issues such as anonymity for porn victims, cross-examination by defendants who are victims of abuses as has occurred in civil courts, distribution of images, sharing of images. We need a fundamental review of all hate crime and sexual legislation to ensure victim protection, access to justice, and therefore a law commission or a body looking at this issue would be a great welcome, and what this makes is recommendation that it is implemented into the law as soon as possible. Coming on to the amendment that the Right Honourable Lady for Basingstoke made, and can I commend her for the tremendous work that she does as the chair of the Select Committee on Women's Inequalities, and the tremendous work that her committee is doing as well. I have to say that her amendments are very cogent and very pertinent to the point, and I hope that the government will address those points and will take on board the matters that she has raised and the issues of concern, and that hopefully that the bill, as it makes its progress to the Houses, that those amendments will be considered by the government. And lastly, coming on to the amendment put forward by the Honourable Member for Christchurch, I do believe that judges should have a discretion in all cases as to decide when and who should be put on a sexual register, and that there should not be a blanket proposal that that should be done. And I think it should be left to the individual judge in an individual case to decide whether somebody should be on a sexual register, because it has very clear implications and repercussions for people who are on the sexual offender register.
I call the Minister, Lucy Fraser.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Upskirting can be humiliating and degrading, and it's appropriate that that is recognised by the criminal law. Whilst the Honourable Member for Bolton South East rightly mentions, whilst there is not a specific offence on our statute books at the moment, fortunately the law does already provide some protection. Prosecutions can be and have been brought under the common law offence of outraging public decency and the offence of voyeurism. But there is a gap in the law which needs to be filled, which relates to where the offence takes place. A person is caught at the moment if the offence takes place in a public place, like a street, under the outraging public decency legislation, and is caught if the offence takes place in a private place under the Sexual Offences Act. But there is a gap if the offence takes place somewhere which is neither public nor private. And worryingly, this could be a school or a workplace. So this bill has been brought forward by this government to seek to address this issue. And as the Honourable Member for Aberdeen South has said, this follows the very effective campaign of Gina Martin. A number of amendments, Mr. Speaker, have been put down by honourable members of this House which seek to expand the scope of this bill, and I'd like to take each one in turn. I would like to assure the Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead that I will take the approach that he took when he was a minister, and I will consider each one in turn on its own merits as a matter of policy and as a matter of principle. First, I will deal with the new clause and amendment tabled by the Honourable Member for Walthamstow. These clauses seek to ensure that when offenders of the crime of upskirting are motivated by misogyny or misandry, this should be considered by the court as an aggravating factor when considering the seriousness of an upskirting offence for the purpose of sentencing. She also seeks to amend guidance to highlight this issue. As the Honourable Member for Aberdeen South mentioned, I think it's very important to point out that the Honourable Member's amendments do not propose that misogyny becomes a hate crime, but are simply raised in the context of the upskirting offence. If the perpetrator of the offence was motivated by hostility against women, that should be taken into account on sentencing. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Member for Walthamstow for providing a further opportunity to discuss these important issues. Whilst the offence is not specific to women, it's likely that women will most often be the victims, and the Honourable Member is very right to highlight that this is something we in Parliament should be thinking very carefully about. While I recognise her motivation, I don't think it would be right to pass the amendments in this bill. This is because statutory aggravating factors don't usually apply to one or two offences, as would be the effect by her amendment. It would make the new offences inconsistent with all other sexual offences, and there is no rationale for the proposed amendment to simply apply to these offences. In relation to guidance, I can confirm that work is already underway to develop and update guidance on upskirting without the need for any legislative obligation to do so. So whilst I recognise the intent behind the amendments, this narrow bill is not the time to debate misogyny becoming a hate crime. However, we as a government are concerned to ensure that our hate crime legislation is up to date and consistent. And I am pleased to announce today that I will be asking the Law Commission to undertake a review of the coverage and approach of hate crime legislation following their early recommendation to do so. This will include how protective characteristics, including sex and gender characteristics, should be considered by new or existing hate crime law. As the Honourable Member for Broxtowe, the Honourable Member for Christchurch, I'll give way in a moment, the Honourable Member for Hemel Hempstead, the Honourable Member for Aberdeen South mentioned, this is the right way forward. I will confirm the Ministry of Justice will make available the necessary funds for the review, and I will write to the Law Commission this week outlining our intention. So on that basis, I would ask the Honourable Member to withdraw her amendments. I'm very happy to take the intervention.
Well, that she has announced her review through the Law Commission. Would she also commit to consider the wider range of protected characteristics which are recognised by some police forces, particularly my own North Wales Police, which considers English and Welsh language as hate crimes protected characteristics? Would you consider those within the review as well?
That is something I'm very happy to take away and consider. I think it is appropriate that when we look at the protective characteristics, as I mentioned, it will include sex and gender characteristics and won't be exclusively looking at those. I'm very happy to consider the point that she makes, and we'll get back to her on that. Secondly, I'd like to deal with the amendments 1 to 4 that the Honourable Member for Basingstoke put forward in relation to purposes. Before turning to the substance of her amendments, I would like to pay credit to her for all her work in this area. For many years as Chair of the Women and Equalities Committee, but also individually as a Member of Parliament, she has continually stood up for the rights of women. I'm very grateful to her for highlighting important points to me on this bill in the committee and more informally. We've considered in the department very carefully the issues she has raised and reflected on them. I will set out in due course how we propose to deal with the points she has very carefully and helpfully raised for consideration. But first, I'd like to deal with the substance of the bill as drafted. In the bill, as drafted, upskirting is criminalised if the perpetrator takes an image with a purpose either of sexual gratification or causing humiliation, distress, or alarm to their victim. The reasons these motivations are identified in this bill is because they are used in other current legislation. By the amendments 1 to 4, these defined purposes are removed, effectively taking away any mens rea to the offence and therefore criminalising the taking of all upskirting photographs, whatever the circumstances. As I understand the explanatory memorandum and some of the speeches today, the intention behind the amendment is that it will ensure that those undertaking this sort of inappropriate behaviour for group bonding or financial gain will be caught. But I'm very happy to give way.
My honourable friend is making it very clear when it's not acceptable to take an upskirting photograph. When is it acceptable to take an upskirting photograph? Because by definition there must be some instances when she thinks it is acceptable.
The honourable member makes an important point. It is never acceptable to take a photograph up someone's skirt without their consent. But we as legislators have a very important duty when we pass laws, in particular when we pass criminal laws. Criminal laws which set out a criminal liability, which give people a criminal record, which have significant consequences for their lives. And I think we need to take that duty and that obligation extremely seriously. And so it is not every act that is inappropriate that becomes criminal. So if I'd just continue and then now, well, I'll very happily take her
The Honourable Lady, I'm speaking to a QC, so I'm treading very carefully here. But we have an obligation as Parliament to be crystal clear to the judges, to the judiciary. And my right honourable friend, the member for Hemel Hempstead, made this point very eloquently in his speech. I think what she has just said is entirely confusing to me and possibly to the judiciary. If she is saying there are examples of where upskirting is allowable, then she should be clearer. She can't have her cake and eat it, if I can be so bold, to say that there are instances, but there aren't really.
Well, I'm very grateful for what the honourable member says, and I have the highest regard for the work that she's done and the importance which she puts on this subject. When the judges look at what is and is not people should be criminally responsible as a matter of law, they will be looking at the legislation we pass. And it is important that that legislation is clear, and it is important that we set out that in the legislation. I'd like to identify the 3 reasons why we think putting in the amendments that she has proposed make the law less clear, less certain, and less advantageous. And so I'll turn to those. The first is that we believe that it is likely that those who do that, for the purposes which it is intended that the explanatory memorandum sets out, and my honourable friend outlined, we think that they will be caught in any event by the bill as drafted. As the honourable member for Rotherham highlighted, if someone took an upskirting image to upload it on a website for financial advantage, that is something we should think about and possibly catch by the Act. But we think it will be caught by the bill as currently drafted, because they intend, in uploading photographs to a website where people pay for it, that others will be looking at it to obtain sexual gratification. Equally, if someone took an upskirting image primarily for a laugh, they would likely be captured on the basis that the amusement is caused by the humiliation, alarm or distress that they intended the victim to feel. I'm just going to continue just because at the moment, and if I've got further time, I will happily take amendments. The second point is that the reason the government doesn't favour including wider scope for the purpose is that a blanket liability risks criminalising those who we don't want to criminalise. The amendments as drafted could bring in serious unintended consequences and risk bringing too many within the scope of criminal law. As the honourable member for Basingstoke recognised, the amendments risk criminalising young children over the age of liability, which is 10, who don't realise the impact of their action and mean no harm when they carry out the act. But there is one further critical issue which the honourable member for Cheltenham mentioned, which is if all purposes are removed by the amendment, there would be no need for the prosecution to bring forward evidence of the perpetrator's motivation of sexual gratification, which could mean that those who pose a real threat to the public are not put on the sexual offenders register because that issue has not been determined in court. The honourable member for Christchurch and the honourable member for Basingstoke highlighted the small number of prosecutions which have been brought in and identified that in the impact assessment we anticipate only a few more prosecutions. Can I point out that the reason for that, and as paragraph 29 of the explanatory memorandum makes clear, there are already laws which catch this activity, and what the impact assessment identifies is the new offences that we think will be caught in relation to this particular narrow gap that we are filling. The Honourable Member for Rotherham rightly stated what we need to do is to change culture, not lock up a whole lot of more offenders, and education is a very important part of that. However, we do recognise the value that the points of the Honourable Member for Basingstoke and others have made. Therefore, I'm happy to confirm that the Government will review the operation of these offences after 2 years of them coming into force. This will include working with the police and the CPS and reviewing cases that have so far been brought. Very briefly, if I could deal with sharing. Amendment 5 would create a further offence of disclosing an upskirt image and sharing that. We in the Department very much share the intention and desire to ensure that the sharing of images will be robustly dealt with. However, the best way to do this is not by way of an amendment in this legislation. Legislating in one area alone is not the right way forward. The Government is already looking at this wider issue. DCMS has already asked the Law Commission to look into online abuse. The first stage of that review, which is an analysis of the existing law, completes in October. And I'm pleased to confirm that following the completion of this first phase of the current review, the Ministry of Justice, working with DCMS, will ask the Law Commission to take forward a more detailed review of the law around the taking and sharing of non-consensual intimate images. This will build on the Law Commission's review into online abuse and will allow the Government to consider how to address this issue more widely rather than just for upskirting images. Because, as the Honourable Member for Basingstoke said, it is not appropriate to legislate in a piecemeal way. The Honourable Member for Basingstoke also mentioned the Scottish changes. My understanding of the Scottish changes in 2016 were not specific to upskirting, but it was a separate offence created in relation to the distribution of intimate images in the Abuse, Behaviour and Sexual Harm Act. This is the broader approach which we in Government want to continue. In relation to the amendments brought by the Honourable Member for Christchurch, he is suggesting that offenders under the age of 18 are not put on the sex offenders register at all. We are concerned that there will be offenders under the age of 18 who need to be on the sexual offenders, and only if we put them on the sexual offenders register will we protect victims who need protection now and in the future. He suggested that we don't need to toughen up. We need to toughen up and put everyone on it who's over 18. That will diminish the effect of the sexual offences register and not allow police resources to be concentrated. I'm sorry, but I've got very, very limited time. So for those reasons, we believe, in the light of the fact that we are offering a review of legislation after 2 years, in the light of the fact that we are offering a review of the offences more widely, I hope that the honourable members who have put forward amendments today will withdraw their amendments.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for listening. For the first time, we are now saying as a country that misogyny is not a part of life. It's something that shouldn't be tolerated, and it is something we are going to tackle. And her commitment to the Law Review Commission, looking at all forms of hate crime, including misogyny, and the need for new and existing responses, and to fund that, is really, really welcome and a positive reflection of what this place can achieve. We've just sent a message to every young woman in this country that we are on their side. On that basis, I'm very happy to withdraw the amendments, and I look forward to working with the Minister and the Law Commission review in taking this forward.
Okay. Is it your pleasure that new clause be withdrawn? New clause 1 by leave withdrawn? Aye. Marvellous. That's great. Consideration completed. Order, order. I remind the House that before the second reading, as required by standing order, the entire bill was certified as relating exclusively to England and Wales and within legislative competence. The bill has now been amended since then. Copies of the certificate are available in the Vote Office and the Parliamentary website. Under Standing Order number 83M, a consent motion is required for the bill to proceed. Copies of the motion are now available. Does the Minister intend to move the consent motion? Nod. Yep, not marvellous. The House shall forthwith resolve itself into the Legislation Ground Committee. Order, order. Then what was it?
So the knife has not yet fallen.
No.
It's on this page.
Okay. And then we can go straight up. Order. I remind honourable members that if there is a division, only members representing constituencies England and Wales may vote. I call the Minister to move the consent motion. The question is that the consent motion, as many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order. Okay, see you shortly. Bit of a mess, I think. Order. Third reading. Sorry about that.
I beg to report that the Legislative Grand Committee, England and Wales, has consented to the voyeurism offences number 2.
Third reading.
Now.
No. Minister, to move formally. Nobody else. The question.
Would like to speak.
Minister, how could one decline it? As much as I could be very tempted, I certainly wouldn't. Lucy Fraser.
I'm very grateful. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak, and I would like to. I cut short some of my comments to ensure that I covered all the points in a report stage. So I would like to mention something that I was going to mention when I addressed the Honourable Member for Christchurch amendments, because I would like to mention that it was suggested at one stage that he had opposed this legislation which criminalised upskirting, and I know that he never opposed this as a matter of substance on this legislation. He objected to it as a matter of procedure, as we've heard today. And like members of this House, he's made clear he is supportive of criminalising this inappropriate behaviour. I spoke to him about the amendments that he put, and I'm very pleased to be able to address them at this stage. Mr Deputy Speaker, I'd like to highlight that this is a simple but important piece of legislation with a very clear purpose: to fill a gap in the law in the prosecution of those who upskirt. I am very grateful for those across the House who have engaged with this bill as it has been progressed, and I hope that that spirit will continue in the other place. We can be rightly proud of this bill, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everybody who has contributed. There's been much discussion about the sharing and upskirting images. It's an important issue and one we need to tackle as a government. But the bill is narrow, and many of the issues that have been raised are not the right place to solve the issues that have been raised. We will, though, work with the Law Commission to look at legislation in relation to the sharing of intimate images. We've welcomed the opportunity to debate the purposes of the bill and whether it will capture all those who commit this offence. The bill ought to catch those who should be criminalised, while ensuring that the reach of the criminal does not extend where it should not extend to. The post-legislative review in 2 years' time will help ensure that the offences are as effective and comprehensive as intended. I am grateful to the House for their support. I also wanted to touch on the issue of notification requirements, which is an important aspect of the bill. It's not an issue we take lightly, which is why we've committed to place those who commit this offence for reasons of sexual gratification on the sex offenders register, subject to certain thresholds to ensure proportionality, focusing resources on those who pose a significant risk to the community, and I'm confident that the bill strikes the right balance on this. We've also had an interesting debate on hate crime, and whilst these are important issues, this bill focuses on a narrow issue, and it is not the right place to bring forward small, narrow legislation. However, hate crime is an area which government is intending to look at closely, and we will be asking the Law Commission to conduct a review on hate crime. Let me conclude by thanking once again and paying tribute to the Honourable Member for Bath for introducing the bill, and Gina Martin, who first raised awareness of this important issue. I would also like to mention the important work that the Honourable Member for Basingstoke has done, both as her work as the chair of the Women and Select Committees and more broadly, to ensure that these important issues on this bill have been debated in this House. It is also important to recognise the contributions from the Honourable Member for Christchurch for putting forward ideas in relation to the Sex Offenders Register, and I am grateful for the Honourable Member for Bolton South East and the opposition for their support in getting this important bill quickly through this House. I'm very happy to give way.
I thank her very much indeed for giving way. I completely agree with her, the very good work that's been done by campaigners in this area. There's one specific point I wanted to make, that so often women and girls have been told that it's their fault if they're harassed, because it's their fault for choosing to wear a short skirt. Does my honourable friend agree with me that this bill puts into law an important point, which is the person who is at fault is not the woman or girl who chooses to wear the short skirt, it's a person who chooses to harass them and who makes the poor choice to take a photo up their skirt.
I think that's a very important point, and it is legislation like this which sends a message as to how people should act in relation to women. I was mentioning the people who've taken this significant part in this bill. The Honourable Member who just spoke is one of those who sat on the committee, and I'd also like to thank the other members of the committee where we had a very interesting debate earlier on in the last session. I'd like to thank the Justice spokespeople from the other parties, the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West, the Honourable Member for Belfast South, and Dwyfor Meriden, who I've worked with very closely as this bill has gone through the House. I also wish to extend my thanks to our hard-working bill team, our private officers, our parliamentary private secretaries, and the whips, who can get overlooked at times. I also wish to thank the clerks and other parliamentary staff for their sterling work and support on this issue. It has been an honour to take the bill from second reading through to today, particularly knowing of the strong support from all parties across the House. I wish the bill a safe and speedy passage through its remaining stages.
The bill now be read at our time. Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I also want to place on record my thanks and appreciation to all the honourable members and right honourable members who served on the Bill Committee. They were genuinely involved in it. They were passionately involved in it. It wasn't one of those cases where the whips had sort of forced you to be on it. People were engaging in the debate and in this particular legislation. It is a small piece of legislation, but a really important piece of legislation which does need to get on the statute book as soon as possible. I'm very heartened to hear the news that the Minister was able to give, that the Law Commission will be looking at this whole area of the law and looking at the recommendations, and I hope that that will be done as soon as possible and that we can implement its recommendation as soon as possible as well. I also want to thank the House authorities and the clerks and the Public Bill Office for all the work they've done, for putting the amendments together, and the tremendous work they have done, and my colleagues as well for being here today. There's a number of people who are here who do not need to be, but still here because they're obviously interested in this bill. And also, like the Minister, this is my first bill which I've taken from the beginning to the end in this House, and I wish it a speedy journey as well, and hopefully that it will be on the statute book soon. This particularly vile and disgusting practice which does need to be brought to an end.
Courage calls to courage everywhere. That's what we've been saying so much this year, and I think the courage of Gina Martin to take action, the courage of the Honourable Member for Bath for following it through, the courage of the Honourable Member for my honourable friend for Christchurch for saying no, and the courage of the Minister for listening, and I very much welcome her clear undertakings today. And I was reflecting, Mr Deputy Speaker, when actually we joined this place some years ago now, I don't think we would have passed a bill like this back in 2005. I think Parliament now has courage to deal with these sorts of issues as well. I very much welcome my honourable friend, the Minister's undertaking to have a Law Commission review on hate crime. That is an enormous step forward, and she is to be applauded for making sure that that happens. Also applauded for making sure that we have a review of this legislation after 2 years, and applauded for making sure that we have a very long overdue Law Commission review into non-consensual intimate images, which would actually make the need for this sort of piecemeal legislation redundant. This bill, I think, is the start of a process of creating a more coherent strategy for tackling non-consensual abusive images and indeed, potentially as well, misogynistic crimes that create such a negative and demeaning environment for women and girls in this country. I wish this bill well in its passage to the other place, and I also hope that their lordships can take a further look at the issues that we have debated here today to make sure that all victims have recourse to justice, and to make sure that the Scottish experience in terms of outlawing distribution in the context of upskirting is also adequately dealt with in the short term as well. And I'm sure their lordships will have been looking in great detail at the discussions today before this bill reaches the floor of their House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The upskirting bill from the very beginning of its journey has been a result of brave individuals, particularly women, speaking out. They chose to speak out about a vile crime that was going not only unpunished but largely unnoticed. They courageously spoke out about their experience to try and draw attention to the gap in the law. This bill is a result of their hard work, and each and every individual who helped this campaign materialize into the legislation before us should feel proud. It was back in February I drafted this bill in time for International Women's Day. As a female member of Parliament, I felt bound to try and honour the day with real change that would improve the lives of women across the country. It shocked me that upskirting was not already a specific crime. There was a victim from near my constituency of Bath who was just 10 years old. It was clearer than ever something had to be done. I spoke to victims and campaigners, notably Gina Martin, and together with her lawyer, Ryan Whelan, we put together a bill that would ensure that taking a photo up someone's skirt without consent would become a specific sexual offence. I'm incredibly grateful for the work of my colleagues across the House. In particular, I would like to say thank you to the Minister for Women, the member for Louth and Horncastle, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for the Ministry of Justice and member for South East Cambridgeshire, and the Prime Minister herself, who have been supportive throughout the bill's passage, from agreeing to back my original bill to tabling another version when mine was blocked in June. Equally, I am grateful to the many members who have supported and worked on this bill, in particular the members of Basingstoke and Walthamstow. To have the bill sponsored by 5 parties and the government, as well as my own colleagues, of course, I think demonstrate not only how important this issue is, but also what can be achieved when we work together. There are many unnamed and unsung heroes in this place, and by this I mean our staff that support us. And I want to put on record my particular thanks to my parliamentary assistant, Jess Clayton. Without her passion and her enthusiasm for this issue and her very thoroughness, she knew at some point a lot more about upskirting than I did personally. So without her help and support, we wouldn't be here today. So thank you, Jess Clayton, my parliamentary assistant. Primarily, though, this bill is a credit to all those seen as everyday or ordinary women who have achieved something extraordinary by campaigning, pressuring those in power, and protesting with pants when the campaign faced adversity. They have ensured that upskirting will become what it deserves to be, a specific sexual offence. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
So, Mike Penny.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's an honour to speak at the third reading. I was going to say from the outset that I pay tribute to the new Justice Secretary of State, my neighbour and my roommate for many, many years, who's been involved in this for many, many weeks, but to the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State. When bills come forward, Mr. Speaker, normally you get a fair bit of notice. You go in and you argue your point with a pre-legislative scrutiny committee, then you argue. Instead of that, here comes a fast one. So it's real real privilege to have took part in this debate as a man, as a father, as a husband, to actually try and understand and get the public to understand what is actually going on out there with this voyeurism and upskirting. So I pay tribute to the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State and to the Justice Minister and our colleagues for listening to this House, because this House is supposed to replicate what's going on out there in the country. So the review into the general area, which well, sure, the Honourable Member for Walthamstow is absolutely thrilled about, is a real movement forward. The amendments that were put down in good faith. I think possibly, and I'm not legally trained, even though I was the Justice Minister, I'm still confused about when it would be legitimate to upskirt. I don't understand that, and perhaps their lordships will look at the amendments and perhaps understand it better with their experiences than I am. But at the end of the day, the piece of private legislation which would have really struggled, we know who was backing it. You know, the Prime Minister and all the way would have still struggled and would not have had the amendments and would not have had the debates and certainly wouldn't have the Law Commission's reports into the general area where we were talking about earlier on. That would never have happened unless we'd have had time here this evening to debate this and take it through. And everybody has quite rightly paid tribute to individuals. Individuals that have put amendments down, members that sat on the committees, our colleagues. But actually what we should pay tribute to is this House. Because without the roles of this pluralistic society and this pluralistic house, democratic process would not happen. And it doesn't happen every day, and there is very rare that we have complete agreement with my honourable friend on the front bench from the Manager's opposition, which we agree on many things on, to have her there today, you know, as happy as we are for this legislation to go to the other house. It's not finished yet. There'll be a lot of scrutiny, quite rightly, in the other house. That's what it's for. It's not to block, it's to scrutinise and look and improve. But I hope that this legislation gets royal assent soon. We can look at the reviews that are coming forward. We certainly all look forward to the Royal Commission's report, and this is a good day for democracy and a good day for this House.
Christopher Chope.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I say hear to what my right honourable friend has just said. This is a good day for democracy, and I'd like to pay tribute also to the Minister for her understanding, which she's demonstrated during the course of this debate, and for her kind personal remarks about my motivation, which has been so misunderstood deliberately by some people and in ignorance by others. But she, because of the shortage of time during the report stage, she was unable to take my intervention when she was responding to my Amendment 6. I know that at the third reading, Mr Deputy Speaker, we're talking about the content of the bill rather than amendments that were rejected. So looking at the content of the bill and particularly that particular part of the bill which my amendment was seeking to address, I think my honourable friend was slightly misrepresented what I had put, what I was suggesting, because far from weakening the bill, I was suggesting that as presently drafted, section 1(4) is not going to ensure that sufficient numbers of people who are guilty of voyeurism with the motivation of sexual gratification actually reach the sex offenders register, because at the moment this bill is drafted in such a way that you can be guilty of voyeurism for the purposes of sexual gratification, but you won't go on to the sex offenders register if you're under 18 unless you've been sentenced to a term of at least 12 months imprisonment, which is extremely unlikely and I think is de minimis. But the more important aspect of it is that under the bill as currently drafted, you won't go on the sex offenders register even if you've committed an offence of upskirting with the motivation of sexual gratification, unless the victim was under 18 or unless the offender has been sentenced to a term of imprisonment or detained in a hospital or made the subject of a community sentence of at least 12 months. And it seems to me that the linkage between committing an offence of voyeurism with intent for sexual gratification should be directly with the sex offenders register, and I don't understand why the government has been unwilling to tighten that up in the way that some of us would have wished. But I hope that that will be able to be considered in the other place. And like my right honourable friend for Basingstoke, I hope that the other place will also look carefully at the restrictions which are contained currently in section 1.2.1b of the bill in relation to the necessity of proving a purpose for the purposes of voyeurism in order to establish a guilt of that. My honourable friend on the front bench talked about mens rea. I'm not sure whether there is, in due course we'll get on to women's rea. But anyway, as far as mens rea is concerned, I would like her to understand and explain how it is that under the current offence of outraging public decency, which she says that there's a gap, a geographical gap basically, that needs to be filled, and this bill is filling it. But under the offence of outraging public decency, which is a common law offence, there is no requirement for mens rea. And that is a common law offence which is on the statute book. So if there's no requirement for mens rea in relation to that, why are we saying that the statutory provision to fill the gap in the law in relation to geography, the place where the offence takes place, why are we saying that that gap can only be filled by a piece of legislation which does include a requirement of mens rea and a requirement to prove the motive of sexual gratification in particular, and other motives besides. But why, and as my right honourable friend for Basingstoke was saying, which are the instances of voyeurism which are currently subject to the common law offence and can be prosecuted under the common law offence, which of those offences will not be able to be covered by, which of those activities will not be covered by this bill in the geographical location which is not covered by the offence of outraging public decency. And it doesn't seem to me that my honourable friend has dealt with that conundrum or that issue, and I hope that in the absence of it having been dealt with in this House, that it will be dealt with in the other place. And my honourable friend has offered a review of the legislation after 2 years. Obviously, that's better than nothing, but I would suggest that the best thing for her, with the greatest respect, and her department to do is to review this bill between now and the time that it is debated in the other place, which hopefully will be a lot shorter than 2 years, so that we can try and get some consistency across this. Because as a leading counsel, my honourable friend will know that where you have a common law offence and then you introduce a statutory offence, the statutory offence trumps the common law offence as a matter of principle. And surely it is the motivation of the government to simplify the law in this area and ensure that all offences of upskirting are dealt with under this legislation rather than under the common law. It seems to me that that would be very clear. It would be helpful to spell that out, not least for the benefit of police officers or the prosecuting authorities in the future. And if that is what the intention is, and drawing an analogy, as I did earlier, Mr. Deputy Speaker, between the offence of using a mobile phone while driving as against the offence of driving without due care and attention, that there is a lot to be said for having this specific offence covering all instances of upskirting. And if and when the Minister addresses that issue, perhaps she will then be able eventually to come up with the answer to my right honourable friend's question as to what offences of upskirting she believes should be not subject to any criminal sanction. And I think that's the challenge that we're putting out to my honourable friend. From all the correspondence I've had, people feel that all upskirting offences should be the subject of the criminal law and criminal sanctions, irrespective of the motive. And so if there are going to be such offences which are not subject to the criminal sanctions, then we need to spell those out squarely and fairly, which I don't think has been done so far. So Mr. Deputy Speaker, I while welcoming the scrutiny that this bill has received so far, and the way in which the Minister has certainly accepted the spirit of the new clause and her willingness to look again at the other issues, I'm happy to support the third reading, but hope that when eventually this bill returns to this House, it will come back with some amendments from the other place, which the government will then accept, and it will make the bill even better than it is at the present.
Very.
The question is the bill now be read a third time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We can now come to motion number 6 related to the selection committee. Minister to move.
Beg to move.
The question is as on the order paper. As many of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to the whip.
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is this House do now adjourn. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and for calling me. It is a great privilege to have been drawn to one of these end-of-day adjournment debates, giving, as it does, a backbencher like me the opportunity to debate a subject dear to their hearts. It's a fairly dry topic tonight, but it's a very, very important one. And I mentioned it's a dry topic. I hope the House will forgive me and those watching if I plough into quite a lot of detail, because I think the detail is important on this particular issue. And I welcome the Minister, who I have a very high regard for, who's in his place. And another advantage of these debates is the poor Minister has to sit there and listen to me. And there's nothing that he can do, he can't escape. And so I hope my words will fall on receptive ears, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This particular debate follows a recent public meeting on Portland in my constituency, where the beds of the island's much-loved community hospital have been closed, but more on that shortly. We've heard it before, and it needs to be said again. We are facing a desperate shortage of nurses. Health Education England believes there are 36,000 nursing vacancies in England, while the Open University says it's 38,000. And the Royal College of Nursing gives a figure of 40,000. This last figure equates to an 11% vacancy rate, with learning disability and mental health nursing the most affected, followed by community nursing. These gaps may be filled by bank or agency staff on a temporary basis, but Health Education England estimates that 1% remain permanently unfilled. The knock-on effect, Mr. Deputy Speaker, places nurses under, and I quote, relentless pressures, unquote, according to a report this January by the Health Select Committee, which adds that nurses feel that, and I quote again, professional registrations were at risk because they were struggling to cope with demand, unquote. Meanwhile, any increase in nurse numbers is swallowed up by the demand for more of them. For example, while the number of new nursing positions created between 2012 and 2015 rose by 8.1%, those who actually joined the profession increased by only 3.2%. The consequence, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Well, costs obviously rise. Temporary nursing staff are expensive, with NHS trusts paying an average of 61% more for every extra hour worked, compared to a newly qualified full-time registered nurse. A Freedom of Information Act request by the Open University in January revealed that if the hours worked by temporary staff were instead covered by regular nurses, the NHS could save as much as £560 million a year, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The independent health think tank, the King's Fund, revealed that, on average, NHS trusts are spending nearly 7% of their salary budgets on agency staff, and with the figure rising to more than 25% in some cases. Dorset Healthcare, which covers my own constituency of South Dorset, forecast an overall spend of £4 million this year on agency staff alone. This is down from a staggering £12 million 3 years ago, but still represents a significant share of the healthcare budget. As I mentioned at the start, 18 beds were closed at Portland Community Hospital last month due to a lack of nursing staff. Almost half of all nursing positions were unfilled in the hospital this summer. I'd be delighted to give way to my honourable friend.
Mr Deputy Speaker, thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. I sought his permission to do so beforehand. He's outlining the case for the shortage of nurses across in his own constituency and across the UK mainland. But there are shortages of nurses across in many other parts of the United Kingdom, and one example is in Northern Ireland alone, where some 1,800 nurse shortfall. Does the member agree that training of nurses is very important, obviously, but it must be a priority for the Health Trust and for the Health Department as a whole, and that part of attracting new nurses is by showing how we value their current nurses with decent pay and also with working conditions? So it's important to ensure that the nurses are thought of highly for the work that they do, but also paid accordingly.
Well, I don't disagree with any of that my honourable friend has just said, and I will come on to a little bit more what he's saying a little bit later in my speech. And yes, of course, all nursing staff should be appreciated and paid properly, and one of the issues we'll hear in a minute is the work environment, which is one of the factors leading to less nurses, or not sufficient numbers, entering the profession. I was, just before the intervention, I was talking about my community hospital in Portland, saying that the nursing positions were unfilled this summer. Agency staff, costing as much as £58 an hour and £135 per hour on bank holidays, was still hard to find. The Trust Chief Executive, Ron Shields, who I have an enormous amount of respect for, decided he could no longer safely keep the beds open. And so, despite the understandable protestations from islanders who wish to keep their frail and elderly relatives close by, the beds migrated to a hospital in Weymouth, where the nursing staff available can be consolidated. I suspect this situation is not uncommon across the rest of the country. The crux of the matter, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the recruitment and retention of nurses. Recruitment depends mainly upon training new nurses for the future. The numbers required are traditionally set by Health Education England, which then commissions the nursing places from further education and training establishments, including colleges, universities and the Open University. Standards are set and approved by the Nursing and Midwifery Council, ensuring uniformity across providers. These establishments, in turn, invite applications either for registered nurses, nursing associates, nursing apprenticeships and nurse first. The first role requires a degree, the second a prior healthcare qualification. The third is a joint initiative between individual health trusts and further education establishments, while the fourth is a new initiative to high-flying graduates and follows the lines of Teach First. The 3-year degree option, though, remains the main route into nursing. While many, like me, dispute the need for a degree, the Nursing and Midwifery Council says that is to misunderstand modern nursing. Registered nurses are now, and I quote, an officer class, unquote, according to Geraldine Walters, the Council's Director of Educational Standards, with much of the work for degree-level nursing now highly technical and demanding. In some cases, registered nurse prescribers replace doctors, and indeed even run their own primary care clinics in London. So far, the Nursing Associates programme has been a success. In December 2017, 2,000 nursing associates were in training. This year, it's hoped the figure will be 5,000, rising to 7,500 in 2019. The Nursing and Midwifery Council are clear that more recruitment and widened access into nursing training are essential, as is the diversity of training provision. The Open University, for example, provides for those who, for a variety of reasons, would not gain access to the profession via the traditional campus-based route. Since 2002, Open University has offered a 4-year registered nurse degree apprenticeship, in addition to the straightforward apprenticeship, aimed specifically at existing healthcare support workers who welcome the chance to earn while they learn. So far, it has trained more than 1,000 applicants as registered nurses, with 940 more currently on the programme in England. One huge benefit, Mr Deputy Speaker, to the scheme is that participating trusts seem better able to retain the nurses that they have trained. Compare this with a 24% dropout rate for student nurses on the degree course. And as the NHS is the nation's biggest contributor to the 5% apprenticeship levy, it would be odd for them not to participate. The loss of the bursary scheme has been keenly felt, with the Royal College of Nursing saying it's a serious own goal. It was a support package, including tuition fees, a non-means-tested maintenance grant, a means-tested bursary itself, and other elements designed to help students with placement, travel, and childcare costs. It was overwhelmingly popular, Mr Deputy Speaker, attracting more applicants than there were places. It was replaced by the student loan scheme, requiring students to borrow money to pay for their training. The problem is that nursing is a vocational training and does not cater for school leavers unsuited to the profession. Significantly, since the bursary was removed, the number of applications for nursing through UCAS has fallen by 1/3 since March 2016. While the Department of Health says there are 52,000 nurses in training, more than ever before, those accepted onto courses is still down by 9.3% in England. This threatens the pipeline of new nursing talent, and at the very least should and could have been anticipated. Much needed mature applicants, many with care experience, are also deterred by the burden of debt and loss of earnings. And these are exactly the people the profession needs, Ms Walters told me. They also tend to choose careers in specialist areas worst hit by the staffing crisis, such as learning disability and mental health. New figures from UCAS show that applications for both nursing degrees and from mature students are down by 33% and 42% respectively since March 16. As the latter group are the very people who will be grateful for any support given and probably remain in the organisation until retirement, Mr Shields suggests that trusts should provide some form of financial support in the absence of bursaries. A recent survey by the Open University showed what effect the loss of the bursary has had on recruitment. Only 30% of nurses asked said they would have been willing to self-fund or partially self-fund their initial nursing education. In addition, more than half of those surveyed believed applications would continue to fall. Attracting nurses back into the NHS after they've left is another crucial focus for recruitment, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Return to Practice campaign, run by the Nursing and Midwifery Council, which provides refresher training and a re-entry route back into the NHS, has already recruited almost 2,500 former nurses and is currently registering another 1,800. However, as the Health Select Committee report states, and I quote, "Too little attention has been given to retaining the existing nursing workforce, and more nurses are now leaving their professional register than are joining." The committee cites many causes, including workload pressures, an inability to meet patient expectations, concerns about providing adequate care, poor access to continuing professional development, poor organisational culture, pay restraint and budget cuts. The impact of Brexit was another reason, although interestingly, briefings from the Commons Library show that overall EU staff numbers in the NHS have in fact fractionally risen since the referendum, with EU nurses falling by just 0.3 of 1%. Another issue is the current pensions arrangements. Senior and experienced staff who might want to work beyond 55 are leaving because their pensions reduce in value if they stay on. Mr Shields has recently lost 2 senior and valued members of his team and believes the government must look at this urgently. A partial solution to increase nurse numbers is to recruit from abroad, including Commonwealth countries. However, this was, until recently, severely limited by immigration rules, which were wisely relaxed in June after an intervention by Home Secretary Sajid Javid. In December 2017, Health Education England published its draft health and care workforce strategy for England to 2027. Called Facing the Facts, Shaping the Future, anticipates a significant shortfall in nursing numbers due to an increase in the number of posts needed. The Health Select Committee has emphasised that future projections of demand for nurses should be based on demographics rather than on affordability alone. A final workforce strategy is expected from the Health Education England any minute, and perhaps the Minister can enlighten us when he stands up and replies, as it was expected, as I understand it, at the end of July. Finally, can I end by thanking all those who work in our NHS and for the wonderful job they do, not least the fantastic teams in South Dorset.
Minister Bartley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I would like to begin by paying tribute to my honourable friend, both for the campaigning that he has assiduously done on behalf of his constituents in South Dorset and for securing this important debate. And I think it reflects the importance of the debate that my right honourable friend, the Solicitor General, the member for Swindon South, and indeed the Parliamentary Under Secretary for Wales, the member for Eastleigh, are here to listen to the points that were raised by my honourable friend. He has spoken passionately today about the training of nurses in England and the pivotal role training plays in ensuring we have a workforce to deliver first-class services in the NHS. In a budget where 2/3 of our spend goes, quite rightly, on our workforce, then the importance of that workforce is absolutely critical. And indeed, that was reflected in the Secretary of State when he set out his 3 key priorities for the NHS after taking over as Secretary of State. And my right honourable friend particularly emphasised the importance of workforce within those priorities. Of course, I'll give one.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I apologise for not being in at the start of the debate. A number of constituents have contacted me, clearly concerned about the fact that demand for nurses isn't quite being matched by recruitment at the moment, but particularly in relation to the areas of learning disability and mental health. What specifically can the government do, in addition to what it's doing, to really focus on those 2 specialist areas?
Well, the honourable gentleman actually makes a valid point, because I think all of us recognise that learning and disability has traditionally been one of those areas that is harder to recruit. If you compare it, for example, with midwifery, where the number of applicants to training places is a lot higher than it is in learning disabilities. So firstly, I do recognise that there is an issue there. In terms of what we're doing, to give just one example, Mr Deputy Speaker, and then I'll come to the remarks I'm afraid made, but when we looked at postgraduate training, then particularly for more mature applicants, one of the issues was the impact potentially on learning and disability, and that's why we put in place Golden Hellos with a budget of up to £10 million in order to provide an incentive to applicants doing the postgraduate route into nursing to go in particular into the discipline of learning and disability,
into mental health or into district nursing, because it does recognise, I think, the very valid point that the honourable gentleman raises, and that is one of the measures that we have put in place to address that. But it is something we are paying very close attention to, because I'm not suggesting that alone addresses fully the issues that we need to look at. Mr Deputy Speaker, turning to some of the specifics in what I thought was a very well-put speech by my honourable friend, he quite rightly highlighted the cost of agency staff within the NHS, and he suggested over £500 million of potential savings if they were permanent staff. And I think it is a fair point to raise that the cost of agency staff is a key issue. And I think he was very fair in also putting on record that Dorset Healthcare has actually reduced that agency staff spend over the last 3 years from 12 million down to 4 million. And that's not by accident. That is something nationally this government has been prioritising, and I pay tribute also to the work that NHS Improvement has done through placing a cap in 2015 on agency spend, which is very much addressing the point that my honourable friend has raised. And indeed, nationally, we have seen agency costs come down by 1.2 billion since 2015, which shows, I think, the progress made under this government. My honourable friend also understandably put on record his concerns around the local beds moving from the Portland Community Hospital to Weymouth. And I think he mentioned the Chief Exec, Ron Shields, and as he'll be aware, Ron Shields himself has pointed out that there are twice as many patients using those Portland Community Hospital beds who actually come from Weymouth, 6 miles away, in my honourable friend's constituency, as from Portland. So clearly there is a benefit for patients if twice as many of those using the Portland are from Weymouth and those beds move to Weymouth. But I appreciate for those on the island, which on average is 4 beds, are taken by islanders. So it's a relatively small number, but I do realise for those it is an issue. But there is a wider patient benefit, particularly to those from Weymouth. And there's also a benefit for all patients that move to Weymouth, because they can access a wider suite of services, including the services of a consultant with specialist expertise in elderly medicine as part of a wider range of professional support. And it's, I think, to emphasise to his constituents that it is not that the site is closing, it is that services are being reconfigured to reflect changes in the way healthcare is delivered. And that's something, again, that is